Alright, kings, gentlemen, welcome to yet another episode of Scruffy Haired Man trying to talk about culture. Because we're going to be talking about culture today, we're going to specifically be talking about British culture and how it relates to America and the world. Now, before we start talking about it, I want to give a big shout out to friend of the channel, Wyvern the Terrible. Who is British himself, so he's talking from experience, and the accent notwithstanding, I would say that the primary English speaking culture I've interacted with is British, so I know what I'm talking about. I think, maybe, but fundamentally the thesis I'm going with here is that due to cultural traits of both countries, it's usually America that looks up to Britain in cultural matters, and because of America's massive cultural dominance, but also because of the fact that America is culturally downstream from Britain, this gives the British culture an outsized influence throughout the world, and this has some foreign policy implications. Now, I think we can all agree about certain facts of the matter. First of all, Britain and America are genealogically related. So, if countries could have families, then Britain is the father of America, or mother, right? It is the parent, right? I don't even want to get into the whole gender of countries thing. It's too controversial for this channel. Then the other fact is that of all the European cultures, British culture is closest to American. Well, actually, no, I don't agree with that, but let's go with it for a second. And the third thing is that Britain and America share a language, which is very important, which is probably the most important factor we're going to be discussing today. Now, due to a variety of reasons, some of them good, some of them bad, Americans have a massive inferiority complex with regard to Europe. With regard to their own culture. This is because they're a young nation relative to the European nations, and this is because they are, like I said, a successor nation. Like, there was a time in European history, it is very recent, that there was no distinct American identity. Americans, before they were Americans, they were British, or they were German, or they were French, or they were, some of them are even Macedonian. And it's not the whole maybe nation of immigrant. I think that American ethnogenesis started happening about a century after the first settlers arrived at Plymouth Rock, and it was completed, I would say, around the time of the Civil War, which is about the time of the publication of the first American novel, as per Hemingway, which would be Huckleberry Finn. That's a question of literary theory, not really anything. But because of a combination of factors, because of the nation's hard-nosed, hard-scrabble pragmatism and its relative youth, Americans have a cultural inferiority complex with regard to Europe. Now, I don't think they should have it. I don't think America has no culture. I mean, you notice the accent. I consume a lot of American culture, and I happen to like it. And as a European, as an exceptionally pretentious European, I gotta tell you, I see no dearth of high culture in America, but my opinion is irrelevant, because that's what Americans believe, overwhelmingly. Even when they're proud of America, they're saying, oh, we're not like those hoity-toity Europeans, we're actual hard-scrabble, practical folks. And then you got the Americans who believe that, but they would like to be hoity-toity themselves. So what they do is imitate European culture. Even though, yeah, I think if you want to be a hoity-toity American, there's plenty of material to work with. But like I said, what I think doesn't matter. What matters is that Americans believe this shit. Americans believe their culture is inferior to Europe, so they look up to Europe. And they especially look up to Britain for their high culture, for their cultural consumption, because the lack of the language barrier, the sensation of closeness between the cultures, and the genealogical connection. Now, there's an element to that with all of the Anglophone countries, like even Canadians and Australians will look up to Britain because, well, but the fact of the matter is, through the mechanisms of Hollywood and international music charting, and the fact that English is the global lingua franca, even though, franca, that doesn't really matter. It means that America has a cultural influence outsized even to its size and power as a global hegemon, right? That American culture is all over the place, and because the Americans look up to Britain, everything you consume as American culture is downstream from British culture. Now, that's a fact. That's not an opinion. That's a fact. Here's where the opinions come in. So Wyvern the Terrible's thesis is that the British state is actually aware of this fact acutely, and that certain actors within the British state have used this relationship they have with the Americans, which is one-sided on the part of the Americans. Like, no matter what the Brits do, the Americans will ape them. They've used this fact to turn Britain into a global cultural superpower, and thus give the island nation an outsized influence relative to its waning power. Now, we have to understand that beginning with the First World War, British power and influence has been declining. You could even say that British power and influence had been declining for 40 years before the First World War, but that's a whole nother historical ball of wax. If we ever do a video on the legacy of German unification, we have to tackle that. But yeah, the history of Britain for the past 140 years is a history of decline of relative global power, and the British state knows this. The British state knows this, but there has been an effort since at the very least the 50s to position Britain through exploitation of this one-sided adoration of Americans for Britain as the fount of all cultural honors in the world. And it's succeeded, actually. It's so, when you think about aristocrats, when you think about noblemen, do we really think about the, I don't know, for example, the Szlachta, the noble class of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth? Or do you think about British lords and ladies from the Victorian period? Why? Because you watched Downton Abbey. Why did we watch Downton Abbey? Well, because Americans think it's high art. And I don't know, I like it. It's a soap opera, let's face it. It's a real fucking soap opera. It could rival some of the Trinidadian telenovelas I've seen. And I've seen quite a lot of those. That's a little guilty pleasure of mine, but it is fine television. So yeah, that's really your idea of what the aristocracy looks like. It comes from Downton Abbey, a little bit from Blackadder, I would say, a little bit from Upstairs, Downstairs, all fine examples of British television. And I think the British state is very consciously cultivating this. Now, this comes at a problem because we're in a time of great change, where the Americans may be actually. They might still keep looking up to Britain, but Britain is now at a precipice. Britain now has to decide, are we with the continent, which, I mean, you're with the continent, but the continent is a reliable ally, or are you with the Americans? And the Americans are not. The Americans are not reliable allies. They are, well, they've proven themselves perfectly capable of electing psychotic toddlers as president. And when you have a foreign policy commanded by a psychotic orange toddler, well, you're not a good partner to anyone. Have you ever been shackled to a lunatic? It's unpleasant. It's an unpleasant subject. You have a mentally ill relative. We've all been there. I too have a screaming schizophrenic aunt locked up in the attic that nobody's supposed to talk about, but everybody knows. It's a classic trope of Victorian literature. But now it is the most powerful ally of the United Kingdom, which is being run by the psychotic toddler or the aunt screaming in the attic. Fucking insects. Yeah, I'm near the American embassy. They must be dispatched by the magazine side to disrupt the video. Anyways, where was I going with this? Yeah, so anyways, Britain now stands at a precipice. Do we stay with the Americans, or do we just sort of slide back into the continent, start working with these people for the first time in how many years, and that's going to present a problem for the United Kingdom. That's going to present a problem for Britain because before, while it was very obvious that America was the leader of the alliance, if the leader of the alliance thinks he's an uncultured peasant and looks up to you for spiritual, moral, and cultural guidance, then, well, you have a lot more say in that alliance than you would otherwise, even relative to your own contributions. And make no mistake, like, Britain is a small country of declining power and has been for a very long time. Now, it doesn't have to be like that, but in order to do that, it would have to unfuck its own domestic problems. And I don't think the political will is there in the United Kingdom for that. We can talk about British domestic problems some other time. They are many, many and numerous and very intractable, I'm afraid. Or you can go with the continent. And on the continent, Britain can only really be second fiddle to France. Now, to be frank, to be completely and perfectly frank and fair, I've heard it said from Vivienne Westwood, whom I suspect has been helped by the British state in her cultural endeavors. And I'm not saying that as a bad thing. I mean, I enjoy Vivienne Westwood fashion as much as the next bloke. She has said before that essentially the history of Western culture and Western civilization can be boiled down to resolving the tension between Paris and London. And that is correct. But there is a tension there. Paris versus London is a battle of equals, butting heads, both culturally and morally and spiritually and politically and, at times militarily. Whereas Paris versus London and New York, London and Washington, that's a one-sided relation of adulation, except for that one, two brief spats in the 18th and 19th century, in 1776 and 1813. America has, for the most part, worshipped the ground the British have walked on, and the British have, well, they have nothing of the sorts on the continent. They have the admiration of the Germans, but not the adulation of the Germans. And the French, they may have gotten over their little obsession with one-upping les rosbifs militarily, but they're never gonna adore the British. And this, I think, plays a big factor in the British decision. Are we going to go with the Americans or with the continent? Do we accept that we're going to be the third fiddle of the European alliance after the French and the Germans, and we're not going to have outsized cultural influence, or if we do, it's going to start declining because we no longer have the Americans to pipe it through? Or do we take the risk, shackle ourselves to the lunatic, and more importantly to the country which elected the lunatic twice, and before that elected George Bush twice, which is, we're going to have to talk about that some other time. It's going to take a lot of boldness from the British to actually ally themselves with the continent over the United States. Now, I see the objection. Why not both? And ideally, we would have both. We wouldn't have to fight each other as Europeans, Americans included. We don't live in an ideal world. We live in a world where America has chosen lunacy rather than sense. And that's going to have implications for everybody, including the British. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk, and I guess I'll see you next time.